And so if you have someone going around trying to create a representation of the darkness, twistedness, and fragmentation of the modern world, if you have such a person going around creating places which reflect that, then you have them creating a society as well that is characterized even more by the very things which they're trying to illustrate. So they are indeed prophets, but they're self-fulfilling prophets. I'd like to talk about modernist architecture today. Not only modernist architecture, but modernist aesthetics. And particularly, I'd like to focus on where modernist architecture came from. And I'd like to tell that story in a bit of a different way than from how it's typically portrayed. And I'd like to talk also about the success of modern architecture. Why was it successful in dominating the architectural establishment? Why is it the main mode of academic research right now? It's been around for a long time. Why is it that there's been criticism of it for so long and yet it hasn't really left us? We're living in an age where science is exalted above almost everything else. So why is it then that despite being demonstrated to be profoundly unhealthy for individuals, for cultures, for the uniqueness of cultures, and the environment itself, why is it that modernist architecture remains the driving force within the architectural establishment? Why is it that there are maybe 5 schools, if that, in the entire world that teach traditional forms of architecture? How is that possible? Why is it that people who try to follow that path in school are ridiculed by their peers and their professors? There's a lot to talk about. So I'd like to start with a few general principles which I think will help us going forward. And the first is, when I talk about modernism or modernist architecture, I'm not merely talking about the architecture of the, say, 1920s to 1960s. So if you're thinking only of mid-century modernist architecture or Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, great, but also we're going to be covering more ground. There are more architectural movements out there which, despite proclaiming to be different from modernist architecture, I will argue are fundamentally the same. Now, there are certainly differences that we can recognize, but what I'd like to make the case for is that there is a particular kind of architecture. You can call it whatever you like. I'm calling it modernist architecture because I think it's simple and recognizable, but there is a particular type of architecture now, an ideological approach to design that is radically different from the architectural styles prior to the 19th century. Second thing, which I'd like to give you a little bit of a preview, is that an architectural style it's not really a style. It's something more than that. It's perhaps what we could call a form language. Now, I haven't invented the term form language. It's been in use by others for quite some time. Christopher Alexander, if you're not familiar with who he is, I would highly recommend that you look him up. Christopher Alexander used that term quite frequently, as well as Nikos Salingaros and their contemporaries. But I'd like to first talk about how modernist architecture and aesthetics is fundamentally different from the architecture which preceded the turn of the century. And to do that, I've created a simple and silly graph. This is a graphic, I should say. This is what might be called a network. Okay. On the network, you have nodes, and then you have these connections between the nodes. Now, in this particular graphic, the nodes represent styles of architecture or form languages. So let's say, for the sake of it, that one of these guys towards the center is Greek classicism. Another one over here is, let's say it's ancient Chinese architecture. Maybe we have also some Middle Eastern form languages towards the center. And then all of the rest of these are other form languages which have had contact with those architectural styles and have been inspired perhaps by them. So maybe we have Romanesque in one section, and then we have Gothic in another section. And of course, the Gothic is building on the lessons learned from the Romanesque. And yet, there is somewhere on this graph, we could also say a Romanesque revival, a Richardsonian Romanesque from the United States, which is in turn getting its inspiration from the older version of the Romanesque. So these styles are in conversation with each other. Now, of course, when I say that, it's not quite true. These styles are not real things. They're not people. They don't actually communicate with each other. The styles themselves are what we see. They're the conglomeration of ideas which have been passed from one person's mind to another person's mind at a large scale and across time. And so a style is really nothing more, which is perhaps a poor way to say it, but it's nothing more than the communication of various ways of doing things from one group to another group. And so this graphic shows the interconnectivity of all these things. Now you'll notice I also drew a couple little nodes that are sort of far away from the center. This is just indicative of the fact that there are some places on Earth that were not well connected to other places, whether it was geographically or perhaps there were not trade routes that went through those places. There's a number of reasons why this can happen. But the end result is that these particular places didn't have the same kind of complexity of stylistic influences moving through their region. And so there are some places on Earth where the architectural styles have remained remarkably consistent, if you will, for millennia. This is the case with some places in, say, Australia, Africa, North America as well, slightly less so. But there are places around the world that simply have not had the degree of activity as other places. And this graph gets at that. Now, this, I think, is a helpful way of looking at things because there have been other attempts to show the development of an architectural style as an evolutionary process by which some sort of grandfather of all architectural styles gives birth to these other styles, which then branch off in some very simplified way. There's an image, if you look up Bannister Fletcher, Tree of Architecture. He basically creates an evolutionary analogy from phylogenetics of architectural styles branching from sort of the main trunk. And while it's an interesting and somewhat helpful way of looking at things, it just doesn't really capture anything near the reality of what's really going on, the complexity of what's going on in history. So you might be wondering, why then does modern architecture have anything to do with this? Well, I'm going to draw something here, and I'm going to clip this on my shirt so that I can stop holding it. So, modernist architecture comes along, not all at once. It doesn't just appear. It does indeed have connections to the past. So let's say it's connected to one of these guys here. We don't know what it is, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Let's say that circle there is the modernist architecture of the 1910s. And of course, they're reacting against some of the Art Nouveau ideas, and perhaps they're growing out of the Art Nouveau ideas. And so you have these different trades and crafts and workshops, philosophies going on. They're connected to each other. And so we're getting different forms, competing forms, sometimes aligned forms of early architectural modernism. And so let's just say, for the sake of it, that now we've moved to the 1910s, 20s. Let's just say that this is the modernism of the 1960s. This is what you might think of as modernism. This is Mies van der Rohe with his glass and steel buildings. Okay. And then let's say some people come along and they say, that's boring. We don't like that anymore. We'd like to get back to the real history. It's a noble claim. And they create postmodernism. postmodern architecture. Now, postmodern architecture is unfortunately, in my opinion, held back by some of its own pretensions. And so while it's claiming to be connected to the past, and it is indeed connected to the past, it's connected in an ironic way, intentionally ironic way, almost as if the practitioner of the style is a jokester. And so they're looking back at some of the ideas present in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, and the Mannerist periods, and they're taking a lot of those ideas and putting them into their own time frame, albeit in a strange and intentionally, I would say, anti-human way. Now, this is certainly not all of the postmodernists. There were many that were, I think, on the right track, whatever that means, but there were many of them who were doing it because it was a fad. So we have postmodernism here. Then, we've got another guy coming off here. He's what we'll call deconstructivism. The deconstructivists are saying everything else was a sham. We have the right ideas. They claim to recognize sort of the nihilism of man, and they oftentimes hide behind their pretensions about the architect as a prophet of social ills, and so they feel that their duty as an architect is to represent the pain and suffering of the world through their art. Unfortunately, the art of an architect is the public realm and the private realms, the places where people live their lives. And so if you have someone going around trying to create a representation of the darkness, twistedness, and fragmentation of the modern world, if you have such a person going around creating places which reflect that, then you have them creating a society as well that is characterized even more by the very things which they're trying to illustrate. So they are indeed prophets, but they're self-fulfilling prophets. So the deconstructivists are illustrating something of their own time. Now again, the deconstructivists are connected back to the modernists of the 1960s because, as Mies famously said, there is something of the spirit of an age, and so Mies and others of his time felt that they were trying to, that it was their duty to convey something about the age which they were in. And so it was almost as if they were being swept along by this cultural river, and they felt that what was best and most honest, you'll hear that word thrown around a lot, what was most honest was to somehow exhibit the age within which they lived. Okay, so we have quite a few form languages or styles, which all these I'm going to say are modernist. Why is that? Well, it's because despite the tenuous connections that they have to the past, they don't have some characteristics which all of these have. So if I had a big highlighter right now, I would take a giant highlighter and just go over this entire section with it, because this entire section of the network has some commonalities. It has a profound number of commonalities, in fact, and I'll mention just a few of them here in a moment. But these commonalities that are shared by the members of this network are not shared to a very high degree in the members of this network. Okay, so what are some of those commonalities? Well, there are quite a few. One of them we could say is symmetry. Symmetry is, to be sure, present in some of these styles to varying degrees, but it is very present in these styles and these form languages all around the world. Why? Well, there's a variety of reasons. One of them is the fact that these people are building without, prior to the 1900s, they're oftentimes building without the degree of drawings that we have today. So today we're able to build things that are very strange shapes and plan because we have the ability to shoot lasers and pinpoint very precise things. And while they certainly were very precise, still in some cases prior to the 1900s, much of what was common architecture needed to be built by the average person, the average mason, the average carpenter, craftsman. And so symmetry is simply easier. But that's not the only reason. Symmetry is also found in most living things. Most living things exhibit some kind of symmetry on some axis. And so while nature analogies can sometimes be tiresome, I think that there is a good case to be made that symmetry itself is one of the evidences of life. Now, of course, by itself, it's not the only thing that is an evidence of life, but it is one evidence, whereas asymmetry on a global scale is oftentimes associated with inorganic materials. Take a giant rock, perhaps. It has no line of symmetry upon which all of the things rotate. And yet, you can look at things from single-cell bacteria all the way to large-scale mammals and find that they typically have some kind of symmetry. And on top of that, they oftentimes have nested symmetries. So, for example, the human body has, of course, the bilateral symmetry down the middle, but then there are also numerous subsymmetries within the human body as well. And so this is a sign, I think, of a living organism. Now, 1960s modernism, to be sure, had a lot of symmetry to it, but deconstructivism, not so much. Look up some deconstructivist buildings. They're very intentionally anti-symmetrical, many of them. Postmodernist architecture, some of it is symmetrical. Another thing that these styles have, which the modernist styles lack to a high degree, is detail at the small scale. So, say about the size of a hand. If you think of the buildings of the 1960s modernism, what is their defining characteristic? It's the absence of texture, typically. I'm making generalizations here, but it's the absence of texture on walls, on floors, on ceilings, on windows. Everything is a surface. And there's rarely any kind of tactile quality to things. And there is also not a lot of surface folding. So they talk a lot about the creation of space and the importance of space, and yet they seem to be missing the picture on the small scale. So while they might create really quite a profound space at the scale of multiple feet, they are not manipulating the small spaces, which again is very unnatural. And it really is. I mean, if you think about the most inhospitable environments on Earth, they are places without much differentiation of texture and form. So think of a desert, for example. There's not a whole lot of differentiation on, say, the scale of a hand. It's the same thing over and over and over again for a long, long time. Think also of a snowfield or something like that. Or even the ocean, right? The ocean, the desert, and snowfields, they are quite beautiful, and modernist architecture has the potential to be quite beautiful. And yet, they are also quite devoid of life, and they are very difficult to survive in without assistance. Whereas a place where people live, a place that is known for, it's known archetypally as being a place of human habitation. You think of a garden, you think of a forest, you think of a place that has lots of detail at all scales. So you have the detail, the large scale detail of this cylindrical, tree trunks, and then you also have these tiny serrated leaf edges. So all of these styles, from Chinese to African to South American to European to North American, they have incredible amounts of fine detail. Is this something that was forced upon people? No, this is something that was a natural result of their instinct, I think, when people were creating things. And so that's one of the reasons why you see, even in cultures that were relatively untouched by the stylistic transmission that was happening in other places, that's one of the reasons why even they have similar archetypal methods of ornamenting things and of creating differentiation in surface, pattern, texture, and so on. So those are just a couple, but my point is that these styles are in fact fundamentally different. And I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but it really is important to understand this, because if someone comes to you and says, well, these are just modernist architecture and its associated styles, they're really just developments on the past. And if someone says that to you, I would recommend you question that, because Well, of course, everything is a development on the past, but is it really connected to the past? What kind of commonalities does it have with the past? Now, of course, all of this is moot if um, if these in fact are better styles, right? So if these guys up here are better ways of doing things, then it shouldn't matter that these are fundamentally different from here, because it just means that we've learned a lot and we've gotten better at doing things, right? Well, the issue comes when we discover that these are actually not as good at accomplishing many different things as these are. And so that's what I'd like to transition to and talk about a bit. So, why are these newer styles, this family of modernism, why is this family so detrimental to society and to various cultures? One of the reasons is that uh, it is totalizing. In other words, it is spread from one place to another, from point A to point B, and then it takes over the way that people did things at point B, and then eventually the people in point C are infected as well. Now, this would not be a problem, of course, if it was a beautiful and helpful way of doing things. So someone might ask then, okay, well, if we're looking at this from an evolutionary sort of analogy, why is it that that people accept it? Why is it that modernism has become so dominant in the institutions? Why is it that in developing countries they're oftentimes welcoming modernism and all of its aesthetic implications and societal implications? Why is it that they're doing this with open arms if it's in fact so harmful? Isn't that evidence that we've got this all wrong and that modernism and modernist aesthetics are indeed good for the world? Well, I would suggest to you that something can spread quite quickly and quite successfully without being healthy, which leads us to the realm of the viral analogy. Now, this is not something that I have invented myself. This is something that's talked about at length by a theorist, an architectural theorist, Nikos Salingaros. And he wrote a book called Anti-Architecture and Deconstruction. He's written many books and articles. He's a physicist by training and mathematician. And later in life, he got into architecture and architectural theory. And he makes the argument that modernism, deconstructivism, these things spread like viruses spread. Why does a virus spread? Well, a virus it's not really a life form. It's debated whether or not a virus is a life form and what can be defined as life. But something that Salingaros suggests is that an architectural stylistic virus has the capability to be transmitted, but it doesn't have the capability to create life. This is the same thing for people. So and any kind of animal life. So animals have the ability to both metabolize, to be able to take energy from the environment and transform it into something that's useful for themselves as organisms, and they also have the ability to propagate themselves in various ways. Viruses only have one of those abilities. Viruses do not have internal energy systems whereby they convert other things for their own good and so on. Instead, what they do is they find ways of incorporating the energy of other cells and propagating themselves by parasitic means, essentially. Now, how is that similar to what modernist architecture did? Well, for one, modernist architecture is, at least in the beginning, incredibly simplistic. What is a virus? A virus is the simplest form of life, if you will. It's one of the most stripped down, highly encapsulated bits of information. It's one purpose after many runs of unsuccessful transmission. Its one purpose, finally honed, is to transmit itself. Modernist architecture in the 1920s was quite intentionally intended for this purpose. And so one of the reasons that we think it spread so significantly and so quickly is because it was highly memorable. An idea does not have to be true for it to be spread. We can see this all around us all the time. It merely has to be memorable and easily recognizable. And to be sure, modernist architecture was incredibly recognizable, particularly at a time when the surrounding context was highly decorated. And so in this context of high decoration, high degree of detail, stylistic confusion, some might say, in the midst of all of this, you have this new thing that comes along that is as clean as a white wall. It's there's nothing there to look at except this white wall and some outline, and perhaps they'll throw in a model, some kind of evocative picture. And these elements together, they play on our innate high sensitivity to contrast, our sensitivity to landscapes that are very stripped down, sublime, like a desert, for example. And they capitalize on that and the memorability of the image to be transmitted successfully from one culture to another. And the end result of this, unfortunately, is the erasure of culture. I say it's somewhat ironic because I think today we're living in a time more than ever where people are rightfully talking about the importance of preserving various cultures and preserving their own heritage. So in this globalized world, we're seeing people coming to terms with the fact that whichever group that they came from, it's now almost all groups are in a sort of diaspora. People are moving to all sorts of unfamiliar places. And so in that context, then, you have to figure out what it is that you're all about. And so the strange thing is that despite this push for the recognition of the uniqueness of all cultures and all people groups, despite this push, modernism has a powerful place even within the groups that profess to be all in favor of diversity of culture. And it's rather strange because modernist architecture and all its affiliated forms are anti-local. They truly are. Now you'll hear some people say, "Oh, well, we're vernacular modernists" or something like that, and we take whatever the local style is and we just bring it up to speed with the newest things. And I think that there's perhaps some truth. There really are genuine people doing some of that work, but it's very rare. I think more often the case is the situation when someone says that and then does something different. And you see this all the time, both in the profession, you see it quite frequently as well, more often actually, in the academic institutions. For example, as a student, you can create a project that has absolutely nothing to do with the surrounding neighborhood or city that it's in, and yet you can create a story. And a story, unfortunately, in our society is oftentimes more compelling than the reality. And so you can create a building of stainless steel walls in the middle of an old brick neighborhood and have no windows and one big skylight on the thing, and you can come up with some kind of story to pass it off. You can say that it's the representation of the old train yard that used to be there and how the steel industry was so instrumental to the development of this place, and it's a marker, and it's going to be the heart of the community, and it's going to be so good at drawing together all sorts of different cultural groups. And you can say all these wonderful things, but at the end of the day, it's still a large steel shed in the middle of a brick city. Now, I've already mentioned in passing that the academic institutions are supportive of modernism, but what I have not really mentioned is the fact that they are also antagonistic to just about any of these other nodes, any of these other styles. So this is something that is not my opinion. This is well established. There are very few institutions where you will be permitted freely to to pursue any kind of traditional style or form language, and when I say traditional, I mean prior to the 1900s, you are practically forbidden to pursue this style of design. And so if you are taking a class where you're given a project where you're supposed to design a particular building, you will most likely receive pushback from your professors. Now, there are certainly maybe some professors who are out there who are willing to allow you to experiment, but even they most likely will really push you and be critical. They'll take a critical standpoint and they'll say, well, it's okay for you to explore this idea, but I want you to be sure that you know why you're doing that. Now, that's a very fair statement to make, but they would never ask the other students the same question. If a student was designing a typical student project following the most contemporary form language of the day, whatever the style is, that same professor is unlikely to go up to them and say, "Have you really thought about this form language, and the color and the pattern of this place, and why is it that it looks like all of the other buildings today? Why is it that it looks like all of the buildings that your peers are producing?" you know. And so it's the people who say, "No, I'd like to try to do something prior to the 1900s," and it's they who are persecuted. And oftentimes, and it's unfortunate, I saw this myself, where there were some people who left school because the way that they were designing was antithetical to the approach of the professors. And these students, they were not they were not prolific with what they were doing yet. They did, but they had the foundation there, and they had the desire to learn a particular way of creating things, and yet they were not helped. They were told that what they were doing was out of vogue, out of style, wasn't the way we do things. It's cliche or cheesy. Well, the reason it's cheesy is because they've never had a teacher. The reason it's cheesy is because all this knowledge that was embodied in old buildings and in the building trades, much of it has been lost. And so it's difficult to revive that kind of tradition on your own as an 18 or 19-year-old person. And so it's unfortunate. There were a lot of students who moved on and ended up doing different things. Well, this video has gotten quite long, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing this rambling process. If you'd like to hear more about the subject, I would be more than happy to talk more about it. If you'd like to talk about a particular aspect of it, then certainly please bring that up, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. And this is something, where I like to say we should be cultural creators and not just consumers. We're living in a world where it's very easy to become a consumer, just constantly taking in information. If you're a curious person, you know this very well, that it's interesting to constantly be taking in other people's ideas and opinions, but it's equally as important to consider your own ideas and to be able to practice articulating them. And so I would encourage you, if you have ideas about the subject or any subject for that matter, to share them, at least record them, write them. Feel free to create your own YouTube video and tell me in the comments that you've made something. I'd be more than happy to listen as well to your ideas, because I think that's one of the more constructive ways of using YouTube and similar platforms. So by all means, please engage if this interests you. And I think it may be helpful to talk about some positive movements in architecture. If you're interested in hearing about some really fantastic resources, let me know, because I'd be more than happy to do a video on some of the best architects, I think, that are out there right now. It's difficult to find oftentimes because if you don't know where to look, they're not going to be published in many places. If you've noticed, if you're following any of the main architectural journals or magazines or online websites, or if you're looking at the top buildings on Facebook that pop up, things like that, very rarely are they, I think, beautiful buildings. And it's unbelievable once you start to see what truly nice, beautiful, healthy places look like, particularly if you've visited one before, then it's hard to settle for less. And I think that it's important to start talking about these things in terms of the objectiveness behind them, because there is objectiveness behind whether or not a place is beautiful, whether or not it's healthy to be in. And we can test these things. We can test them empirically. We can test them phenomenologically, that is experientially. And so I think it's important to remember that we're living in an age where science is oftentimes elevated above all else. Well, strangely enough, for whatever reason, there's a lot of things out in the built environment that have been empirically proven to be unhealthy for people, which the people who are working within the trades and within the architectural fields and development and so on have not come to terms with those findings yet and continue to produce things that are unhealthy for people. So if you are interested in hearing about more positive movements and the way forward, so to speak, then I would love to do a video sharing some of the things that I've come across and hopefully set you perhaps on an interesting path as well to figuring out how you can be a part of making the world a little healthier and a better place for everyone. Thank you and have a great day, or if you're listening to this at night, have a good night.